The secret to a great cocktail on a hot summer day, a little bit of Italian ice. Just drop it right fucking in there. You will thank me later. That's a good cocktail. It's gonna be probably the only good thing about my evening, because I am watching Matt Walsh's new documentary, which is now called What Schools Don't Teach You About American Indians. It was called something else, but it wasn't getting any views, so he changed the title. So one thing I want to dispel just right away is the idea that this documentary is in any way a good faith attempt to educate the public about history. The Daily Wire, the billion-dollar production company that Matt Walsh works for, was initially funded by seed money from fossil fuel executives. The reason it exists is to spread culture war nonsense to divide the working class from realizing what these executives are doing to our communities and our planet. And as long as we're squabbling among ourselves, then we can't, take care of them. Matt Walsh is, I think, doing this knowingly. And even if he is just some sort of useful idiot, he is still taking millions of dollars of billionaire Epstein-class money to spread these racist, untrue, anti-intellectual narratives. And considering especially that the fossil fuel industry is the primary cause of climate catastrophe and Earth's sixth mass extinction that's currently ongoing, I think you could make a very good argument that Matt Walsh is committing crimes against humanity. Personally, I think that he should be arrested for those crimes and thrown in prison. Now, when I said that in my last video, a number of you went into the comments to complain about how I was illiberal because I said that Matt Walsh belongs in prison just for free speech, man. Well, free speech kind of has limits though, right? And I'm not talking about saying something racist and getting fired. I'm talking about screaming fire in a crowded theater. And there's also a difference between holding these opinions privately and undertaking a highly financed, targeted disinformation campaign designed to further the interests of the fossil fuel vampires who are actively killing us all, right? I think there's a bit of a difference there. If we're talking about, your sort of garden variety neo-Nazi just walking around in the world believing what he believes, I agree. I think that he should be able to do that. And in fact, I think he should be able to march up and down the street with his Nazi flag so he can let everybody know what a fucking idiot and an asshole he is. I mean, that's what it means to live in a free, pluralistic society. But at some point, when you were using the resources of corporate America, one of the biggest and most efficient and most elaborate power structures that the world has ever seen, practically nations unto themselves, to spread misinformation that is going to harm people and is going to fucking wipe out most of the fucking life on this planet eventually, then it's not free speech, is it? It's a crime against humanity. Anyway, let's watch this stupid fucking Nazi documentary.
So we need to start with a central, critical, and load-bearing myth that supports all the others. The widespread belief that the Indians were peaceful. Nothing could be further from the truth. Since the end of World War II, American academics have pretended that pre-modern humans lived in a state of peace. Academic dishonesty was so out of hand by the 1990s that, according to archaeologist Lawrence H. Keeley, the most widely used archaeological textbooks contained no mention of war before civilization.
How do you define civilization? Clearly, Walsh is defining it pretty myopically, simply as early modern and modern European society. And this is, I think, really dumb. Obviously, there's measurable differences between a society like the Native American nations of the Eastern Woodlands at the time of early colonization and, 21st century America. Obviously, there's sort of measurable differences, but there's also big differences, definitional differences between, say, the Native American nations of the Eastern Woodlands at the time of colonization and, the British nations at the time of Roman colonization, right? Even though I think traditionally, like way back, 19th, 20th century historiography, traditionally people have sort of viewed those cultures as like in similar stages of development. History is not like a video game Age of Empires tech tree. You know what I mean? There's not sort of this predetermined kind of course of how societies develop. You look at sort of Eastern Woodlands indigenous people of pre-Roman Britain, even though they were both like tribal, I think to kind of categorize them as sort of just Stone Age or primitive is a flattening of all sorts of the different sort of societal, hierarchical, social, economic, cultural sort of details and nuances of those societies. It's just a very gross simplification.
Hollywood started portraying Indians as peaceful and noble. Dances with Wolves portrays, of all people, the Lakota Sioux as a peaceful, harmonious community living in balance with the land and the buffalo. The Powhatan in Pocahontas were peace-loving environmentalists who sang about living in harmony with nature.
So unfortunately, I think Walsh is jumping off of a very real historical grievance that many reasonable people, including myself, have. What I'll call the sort of ecological Indian myth. I made a whole video about it. It's the longest video on this channel. It's 2 hours long. Which, kind of portrays, I mean, we've all seen it in media, where it portrays Native Americans as being in harmony with the land, as being essentially these sort of cartoonish environmental stewards, these people with this sort of innate understanding of ecology and of non-human nature and all this sort of stuff. And I think that's essentialist and pretty racist. And again, it also kind of flattens the complexities of those societies. I mean, Native American nations definitely had a much more advanced conception of ecology than colonial societies did. They had very ingenious methods of conservation, which again, I think kind of complicates this whole like civilization versus primitivity binary that Walsh is presenting to us. Because like, I would argue that a society that brings cows and pigs into a landscape and lets them run wild and fells forests and to sell the lumber and basically and brings a bunch of invasive species and just like clears the landscape and clears everything in it and just fucking levels it so they can basically terraform, fucking Surrey and Suffolk and East Anglia onto an ecosystem that's already there. Like, I wouldn't call that civilized. I certainly wouldn't call that, whatever that means. I certainly wouldn't call that moral or intelligent. That said, indigenous people also had lots of differences. They could also be very destructive to their environment. I kind of shudder to think what Walsh is going to make of this. I think he's going to kind of use the legitimate examples of historical examples of Native Americans, kind of being ecologically reckless or kind of fucking up, and sort of not living up to that stereotype and basically use that to portray them as, fucking bloodthirsty savages instead of the complicated human beings who they were and are.
According to the book War Before Civilization by archaeologist Lawrence H. Keeley, somewhere between 90 and 95% of known societies in all of human history were warlike. The less civilized you were, as a rule, the more violent you were. 2/3 of primitive societies were at constant war compared to 40% of civilized states. Now at this point you might say, but what about the peaceful tribes? Not all of them were at war. According to Keeley, those tribes are the exception that proves the rule. Some 96% of American Indian tribes engaged in warfare.
It is absolutely true that Native American nations were pretty much constantly at war with each other, as far as we know. Obviously, a lot of this information comes after colonization, where we kind of start to see written records. We see Europeans kind of going in and compiling a lot of this anthropological information. But at least in the Eastern Woodlands and throughout much of what is today the contiguous United States, this warfare was almost always low level. So it was defined by raid and counter-raid, by battles in which actually not a lot of people would actually be killed. And in fact, a lot of these nations had sort of these sort of ceremonial kind of aspects to warfare where, you know, captives were sort of more important than sort of wiping out your enemy. You know, taking lots of captives and, you know, enslaving people would be sort of a sign of like toughness, of honor, of sort of your own power. You know, there was rarely kind of this genocidal intent that pervades so much of Eurasian warfare, you know, before the Industrial Revolution.
So just how savage were the Indians? We'll get into specific details of some of these raids, but for now we can focus on perhaps the most gruesome detail of all: evidence of cannibalism among American Indian tribes. We know they were consumed because the assemblages of disarticulated bones share a number of features: butchering cut marks, skulls broken, long bones smashed for marrow extraction, bones burned or otherwise cooked, and disposal with other kitchen refuse. One Colombian chief, quote, consumed the bodies of 100 enemies in a single day following a victory. In another chiefdom, war captives were kept in special enclosures and fattened before consumption. Many of these groups smoked or otherwise preserved human meat to be eaten later.
So basically what he's doing here is just a gish gallop of shocking scenes of Indigenous violence against settlers. There was quite a lot of Indigenous violence against settlers. No one reasonable denies that. But this is an age-old colonial propaganda tactic. By focusing on the most shocking, the most depraved, the most brutal kind of example of these interactions and of the, you know, sort of warfare between these people, it essentially justifies Indigenous people's subjugation, right? It's not a complete picture of these people and these cultures. You could maybe argue that he's sort of like trying to go the other direction or kind of correct the narrative. But again, what you have to remember is that this is not a good faith attempt to educate. This is racist propaganda designed to make you hate Indigenous people, to play to your worst impulses. And the goal is, of course, to further the interests of fossil fuel companies who would like nothing more than for, you know, land defenders in various Indigenous nations to get the fuck off their land so they could build a fucking pipeline through it or whatever the fuck. That's what's going on here. So the focus on Indigenous cannibalism is also very old, very tired. I've made several videos about this. Basically, when colonized people, you know, commit cannibalism, essentially what this does psychologically in the mind of the colonizer is it lessens, it puts those colonized people sort of below the threshold of humanity and into the realm of animality, right? It animalizes them. And animals in the colonial perception are acceptable targets of violence. There was cannibalism, sure, in some Indigenous societies, not that much, certainly not like what he's sort of implying here. And, you know, I hate to use whataboutism, but I will just this one time, just because, you know, it's not a... I personally, I don't judge anybody for a little bit of cannibalism, so, you know, whatever, it's no skin off my back. You know, which is that Europeans, at the time that he's speaking of, had an extensive cottage industry of medical cannibalism. Ground up mummies and human bones were sold widely as medical cures. So, you know, one could just as easily be like, oh, these fucking white people grinding up mummies and sniffing them for, you know, syphilis or whatever the fuck. You know, it's just like, that wouldn't be a very complete picture of European society in the early modern era, would it? This is, again, just such a flattening of these cultures and this people. It's such a one-dimensional portrayal. Like, it would be like describing the Norse just as like brutal, bloodthirsty pirates. I mean, they were also poets and farmers and great sailors and explorers. Like, there was so much more to that culture. And it's such a fucking travesty. It's such a fucking injustice that he's fucking doing this fucking stupid shit.
It's clear that the Indians were very violent, engaging in raids on one another, murdering women and children, burning entire villages, committing genocide, in some cases eating each other, which brings us to our next myth. One common myth perpetuated by historians is that the American Indians only became violent after exposure to Europeans.
So obviously colonialism disrupted the indigenous economy. It disrupted indigenous foodways. It made indigenous people much more materially uncertain. So yes, obviously it increased violence. That is what happens in times of material uncertainty, is there is increased violence. There's increased competition for resources. This is like History 101. Do you understand me? This is like very fucking basic shit. So what happens when Europeans arrive on the eastern seaboard of this continent is they bring with them a bunch of trade goods. Now, in the eastern woodlands, indigenous society, trade goods are so important. This is a nomadic society. Trade goods that you can carry with you, especially like ornamentation, this is a sign of status, much more so than like land or owning animals or anything that really mattered to Europeans at the time. So when Europeans show up with these amazing items, of course, these indigenous people immediately want them and immediately start trading for them. So there becomes this very strong incentive for indigenous societies to buy into the European market economy. And once that domino falls, then Europeans can basically dictate the terms of these interactions, right? You see this specifically with the fur trade. Unbelievably disruptive to, basically the entire continent of North America, where you have Europeans demanding that indigenous people find them beaver pelts so that, to continue the trade of these items that are so high status now in indigenous society, as well as specifically sort of weaponry, specifically firearms, which very, very quickly, like almost as soon as there are populous colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America, become a necessity for national sovereignty for indigenous people. Once indigenous people become dependent on the European market economy, then everything changes. Everything changes. Pre-colonial polities of North America go the way of the dodo. New confederacies, new nations, new coalitions of indigenous people come together. I mean, by the time of the American Revolution, basically every organized political kind of nation or society or band or tribe or whatever you want to call it is post-colonial. So it is utterly ignorant. It is like shockingly fucking stupid to argue that there was any kind of continuity in indigenous society before colonization and after it. And yes, absolutely, indigenous society became much more violent after colonization, both to Europeans and to each other. That is unquestionable.
Almost all new settlements formed in eastern North America from 900 to 1400 AD were fortified. And this is because around that time, Mississippian Indians from the Midwest and the South were moving east and in constant conflict with the tribes they were encountering.
So this does nothing to argue against the idea that violence increased after colonization. No one is arguing that there was no violence prior to colonization, only that it increased. What's happening here is of course, that the Cahokia collapsed, that the Mississippian societies collapsed somehow. We don't quite know how. So yeah, a lot of them did move east. There was a period of warfare for a time. There was a period of uncertainty. There was also a period of, dare I say, degrowth, where the urban-dwelling Mississippian cultures broke up into much smaller societies. That is kind of the sort of eastern seaboard of North America that Europeans eventually found, was this kind of like society that essentially had consciously or not rejected urban living and kind of, I guess, empire building, if you could call Cahokia an empire, in favor of much more decentralized, non-hierarchical societies based on kinship networks. That's the the world that Europeans stumble across. Do you see how much more interesting Indigenous history actually is than the way that these fucking fascists are portraying it? Do you see how much of a disservice that he's doing? Like, never mind the fucking racism. Do you understand, like, how he thinks you're a fucking idiot? Like, truly, he thinks you're such a fucking moron.
Not only were the Indians committing atrocities against each other before Europeans arrived, but they also got less violent after the white man got there. According to Keeley, the percentage of burials in coastal British Columbia bearing evidence of violent traumas was actually lower after European contact, 13% from 1774 to 1874, and the very high levels, 20 to 32%, evidence in prehistoric periods.
Prehistoric periods could literally be thousands of years of history, so that essentially tells us nothing. Let's find this fucking book. He's referenced it a number of times. War Before Civilization by Lawrence Keeley. Hey, I just went to the bathroom, but I've been sitting here actually for like 15 minutes reading this book, and it's actually pretty good. So essentially what this guy, Lawrence Keeley, is trying to do, he's writing in the 90s, and essentially he's kind of responding to this idea that I basically just said, which is that, as he calls it, primitive war, which is the title of a fucking dinosaur movie and should not be fucking seriously used in scholarship, because like this whole idea of primitive versus civilized is entirely problematic and semantic and kind of means nothing, or at the very least means different things to each people, and is like full of fucking like Eurocentric bias. So yeah, there's kind of a lot to dig in here, but he's sort of basically saying that he's presenting a bunch of evidence that no, in fact, modern, I'll just say, industrial and post-industrial warfare is less violent on average than sort of pre-industrial warfare. I'm definitely going to sit down and read this whole thing at some point, because I don't agree, but this guy seems pretty smart, seems like a good head on his shoulders, and I want to know. I want to know what his arguments are. Which it's interesting. He's kind of making this comparison between the sort of Rousseauian view of the homme sauvage, the savage man, that basically humanity is inherently good and that society kind of corrupts him. But basically he's kind of arguing that the opposite is true, sort of this kind of Hobbesian, from what I understand. Again, I'm just kind of skimming here. I'll sit down and read the whole book later, which again seems very interesting. And it's free on the Ted K archive. Thanks, Theo, for uploading this, if this was you. Yeah, this sort of is taking this kind of Hobbesian view that, that humans are inherently fucked up, perverted little creatures and, and must be governed. So here's a really interesting quote from the conclusion of this book that I want to read to you guys. So Keeley says, "The real weakness of pre-civilized war making has been, at the highest strategic level, rooted in the weaker logistic capacities imposed by small populations, slim economic surpluses, and limited transportation capacities. These true deficiencies, all determined by the social and economic features inherent in tribal life itself, have made it almost impossible for tribal warriors to conduct planned campaigns and prolonged sieges. It was the concentration of resources and power in hierarchical political organizations, the millions of cannon-fodder citizens subject to their disposal, the galleon, the compass, and the sextant, the ox wagon, steam engine, railroads, and factory production, as well as smallpox, measles, and weeds, that allowed the nations of Western Europe to gain ascendancy over the uncivilized world during the past half millennium." He doesn't put quotes on uncivilized, tellingly. I do. "It was not the much discussed and theatrical weaponry, discipline, and tactical techniques that gave soldiers their eventual triumphs, but their mastery of the rather pedestrian arcana of logistics." Very interesting. Very interesting. Keeley argues that primitive societies would have done large-scale warfare if they could. I would argue that they had no reason to. Saying that people will always do the worst possible thing in the right circumstances is, first off, pretty dismal. And second of all, it ignores the real reason that people do horrible things, which is because they have an incentive to do them. You know, in 2005, here in New Orleans, there was basically no state for like, I don't know, like 3 months or something. No law, no order, you know, people had to fend for themselves. They were on their own, right? Basically, modern life, the modern supply chain as we know it was gone. Um, you would think, and it was widely reported at the time, but almost all of the stories ended up being false, that people would just fall into debauchery, that there would be rape and murder and crime, and people would attack each other and fight over resources and all that kind of stuff. You know what happened instead? People came together. People met up at bars. There's a bar in my neighborhood that was like a meeting place for people during the storm, where people camped out, where they shared resources, where they helped each other. At the abandoned hospital where we shot most of my movie, which is coming out later this year, it's a good excuse for me to plug it, The Vampires of New Orleans, the abandoned hospital where we shot, Lindy Boggs Medical Center, one male nurse stayed behind with everybody's pets when all the people who had fled to the hospital for safety got evacuated. Wasn't mass rape, wasn't mass murder. None of that happened. It didn't happen. And in fact, when these things do happen, both today and historically, when people do commit murder, commit genocide, commit acts of violence, do horrible things, they've got to think up justifications for it. Humans are really good at, we're really good about this. We're really good at doing this. We invent elaborate justifications to get over our natural cognitive dissonance, that our conscience that is trying to prevent us from doing bad things. We have to talk ourselves out of that so that we can do them. You have to dehumanize your enemies in war. You have to create hierarchies. So some life is more privileged than others. And the non-privileged life, well, that's just, whatever. We can just do whatever we want to them because it's like in our perception, in our fucking minds, where all of this fucking hierarchy shit exists, all of this fucking nation state shit exists, it's only fucking here. We've got to think about this stuff. And that's why we fucking go overseas and fucking bomb brown kids. And that's why we fucking are destroying the biosphere of this planet. That's why we do all these fucking horrible things. Because we've invented stories in our own fucking minds that justify them. This is so telling. This is so foundational to the ideology of somebody like Matt Walsh, to the conservative and neo-fascist mind. They are so misanthropic. Some of you fucking idiots think I'm misanthropic because I don't think we should kill 80 billion chickens a year. But you fucking idiots, you don't fucking know misanthropic. You wouldn't know it if it fucking slapped you in the face with its fucking dick. These are the fucking misanthropes. They think that humans are inherently bad, that they're born sinners, that if they had no civilization, if there were no rules, that they would just go fucking wild and rape and murder and fucking do all these horrible things, and that it's rules and authority that prevent them from doing these things. Everybody's born a sinner, and if you work very, very hard and do exactly what daddy tells you to do, can you possibly have the opportunity to be saved. That's what these people believe. Well, I reject that. Because I don't think we need these stories. I don't think we need these fucking rules. I don't think we need any of this. I think that if we're just left on our own, in community with each other, things will actually just work out. Because I don't think that anybody naturally wants to harm anybody else. They do it when they feel like they have to, and when they've invented stories to justify doing it. That's the abandoned hospital, by the way. And because I know you're dying to see what it looks like inside, here's a behind-the-scenes clip from The Vampires of New Orleans, coming fall 2026.
immediate weight walking in here, just like.
New Orleans feels primed for telling vampire stories.
We're, 10 grand, 15 grand over budget, V? Yeah. It was crazy. There was a lot of goo, a lot of bodily fluids. But, we got our shots, we think. Moment of truth comes in the editing room.
Take 3, Mark.
Long before 13 British colonies made themselves into the United States, the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Oneida, and Mohawk, had created a union of their own that they called the Haudenosaunee, a democracy that had flourished for centuries.
Somehow, strangely enough, Ken Burns forgot to tell us that when the Iroquois captured an enemy combatant, the combatant was not immediately executed, but instead tortured during the war party's return to camp.
Oh my fucking god, this is so stupid. When Ken Burns mentioned that Einstein discovered the theory of relativity, he failed to mention that one time he also masturbated into a dish towel. So what? What are our democracies not capable of torturing people to death? Somebody fucking tell Dick Cheney that.
Another pervasive myth about Native Americans combines 2 contradictory ideas into one. Native Americans had no concept of property rights, particularly over land, and that Europeans stole the land from them.
Okay, so there is no contradiction here. What Walsh is describing basically loses the nuance of what was actually at play in these land deals and these interactions. Private property is something very specific. That is a very specific concept that is European and colonial, especially as it relates, to the legal system, right? The legal enforcement of private property. That is a very specific concept. It is different from the idea of personal property. It is different from the idea of communal, national property, which is what was at play in these land disputes. Europeans often understood this difference, unlike Matt Walsh. You often hear, especially in New England, people will say most of this land was bought legally. And that's true, under the European legal system, but many of the people writing these contracts were very aware that this was not an equitable exchange. They were very aware that the indigenous people on the other side of the table didn't quite understand what the European, what they were really agreeing to, or rather that the indigenous people at the other side of the table thought that they were agreeing to something else than the European did. So, it's not a contradiction. Matt Walsh is just a fucking idiot.
Modern moral sensibilities about...
I'm sorry, I take that back. He's not an idiot. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's a stooge for the fossil fuel industry and for the billionaire class. And he is basically trying to incite a pogrom. This is a fucking passion play. It's a passion play. Just like the passion plays in the Middle Ages stirred up pogroms against the Jews. This is a passion play meant to stir up hatred and violence for indigenous people, who, by the way, are murdered at a shockingly higher rate than other groups in this fucking country. There are literally fucking... how many fucking thousands? Hundreds of thousands of fucking missing and murdered indigenous women? A 2016 study by the National Institute of Justice found that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, 84.3%, have experienced violence in their lifetime, including 56.1% who have experienced sexual violence. These are people who are statistically, overwhelmingly, more likely than not, who are going to experience getting beaten up, getting raped, getting fucking murdered. And Matt Walsh is stirring up more violence against them. This guy belongs in fucking prison.
As late as the 1870s, it seemed like nothing could stop Comanche raids on settlers in Texas. In 1871, Indian raids against civilian targets were so brutal, vicious, and numerous that some American military leaders expected all the settlers to leave. Colonel Randolph Marcy, who was on tour with William Tecumseh Sherman, wrote, "If the Indian marauders are not punished, the whole country seems in far way of becoming totally depopulated." By 1874, Comanche raiders were hitting towns from southern Colorado to Kansas to the Texas frontier. Pioneers were terrorized over thousands of miles. On July 26, President Ulysses S. Grant gave General Sherman permission to crush the tribes. Control of the reservations was transferred to the Army, and the Army was to subdue all Indians who offered resistance to constituted authority. Economic strength and better logistics is what helped America conquer the West. But it was also by accident. The final defeat of the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, and the Apache almost directly coincided with the decline of the great northern and southern bison herds.
This is very interesting because in a way he's being quite complimentary to Native Americans, right? He is emphasizing their military skill, portraying Native Americans as basically, winning, in the, Indian wars of the West. In fact, this is like, this is so much like that Whitest Kids You Know skit, where the Native Americans basically forced the Europeans to kill them all.
There's no need to be rash, Indians. We're getting in our boats and we're leaving.
If you go back without killing us all, we're gonna follow you back to Europe and rape all your babies. Then we're gonna rape all the babies in the world.
That is too fucking funny. But of course, everything about this is wrong. So essentially, kind of what he's leaving out, he glosses over the genocide of the buffalo when in fact that was the primary tactic, right? I mean, Sherman and Sheridan knew that they had, that the indigenous people of the Great Plains were dependent on the buffalo for literally everything. So you kill the buffalo and you kill the Indians. It was as simple as that. Also, and of course, Matt Walsh would never mention this because he is a stooge of corporate America and just a fucking useful idiot for capitalism. He would never mention, of course, the strong capitalist motives for the conquest of the West, namely the animal agriculture industry, the beef industry. The West today is defined by cattle ranching, and the meat industry very consciously helped orchestrate the genocide of the buffalo and in turn, obviously, the genocide of the Plains Nations so that they could have grazing land. Okay, I'm done with this. That was really fucking bad. So to sum up, Walsh is advancing a very particular philosophical viewpoint, the viewpoint of this guy, Lawrence Keeley, which I think, Keeley seems to argue it much better than Walsh does, obviously, but obviously it's a very dismal view of human nature. He's arguing we need civilization, we need authority, and we need structure to protect us from ourselves. Not surprising, right? I guess in terms of this time of rising authoritarianism, right? I mean, this video really is a defense of authoritarianism and of civilization. And I want to wrap up here by just addressing a concern that some of you brought to me in the last Matt Walsh response video, which is like, is this, a lot of hand-wringing about like, is this helpful? Is this, you're being so mean and so dismissive. What does this actually do? You're not going to convince any conservatives, that Matt Walsh is wrong and all that kind of stuff. And, I guess what I have to say to that is that people like me, history and science communicators, people fighting against pseudoscience and historical misinformation, have been making videos that have been designed to de-radicalize people and to, sort of like gently coax fascists and conservatives into, the light of evidence-based reason for a long time. I mean, really since Gamergate, right? That this has been like a thing. It's been more than 10 years at this point that this that content creators have sort of embarked upon this mission. And I guess what I have to say is, how's that working out? Is that working out pretty well? So just to clarify this a bit, I am continually frustrated how much we center the feelings and sensibilities of mediocre white sword bros, especially in the history community, that we baby these people, we coddle them as though changing their minds is the most important thing in the world, when I simply think that the reason that we find ourselves at this authoritarian fascist impasse is because people are scared and frightened. They're angry because they have material uncertainty, because they can't fucking afford to live. And it's the wealth inequality and unusual and severe weather patterns exacerbated by climate change that is causing people to lose faith in institutions and embrace magical thinking and embrace authoritarian politics. Changing people's mind, one mind at a time, is quite simply just not the best way to solve that problem. We need to attack that problem at the root, which is to address their economic insecurity. I think this is quite a bit like the period of the witch trials, for instance. I've talked about on this channel before also that periods of witch hysteria often coincided to extreme and unusual weather, as well as economic insecurity. So, it's not that I think that this whole project of getting good information to the masses is useless, but my feelings about it have certainly changed. I'm not saying that no one should post online. I'm not saying that there's, Taylor Lorenz kind of famously says, oh, we shouldn't cede the internet to the fascists. But, I think you can do you can do some harm reduction with Master's tools, but you can't tear down Master's house with Master's tools. And the tech companies since 2024 have said, we're taking a right-hand turn, and we want right-wing voices to be amplified, and we want left-wing voices, we want scientists, we want historians, and we want educated people silenced. The fight isn't on your phone. It's not in a fucking YouTube video. It's not in a fucking, whatever, Doctor Who and Colonialism Part 7, The Reckoning. Not in any of that shit. It's out there. It's out there in the real world. That's where it's actually going to happen. And that's where we've got the best shot. Earlier tonight, I went to my local DSA chapter. We started this little eco-socialist working group. And, just talking for 2 hours and chilling and, just hanging out. We immediately set upon a plan to help this one guy in the city with his community garden. Not enough volunteers are coming out to clean it up, so we're going to go clean it up for him. That's 2 hours of my time. That's less time than I'm going to spend working on this video. And we're actually going to win something. We're actually going to accomplish something. It's dark times we're living in. Stay safe. Get ready. And keep fighting.